It seems to me, Seth, that a lot of the conditions that you're describing are not reliant on Trump for their perpetuation. That if you remove Trump and replace him even with Biden, the phenomena that you're describing are so ubiquitous that how would they not continue? Because what is it other than, as you said, he wants the same kind of presence in our lives that smartphones and screens have, and I like that. And you're right, he does have that sort of showmanship and the sort of psychopathic mutability that lends itself to the conditions you're describing. But isn't this something that's sort of far bigger than Trump, of which he is just the most obvious symptom?
Absolutely. Trumpism will endure no matter what happens to Donald Trump politically, personally, or in any sense. The reason that Trumpism will endure is that there is a hunger in the United States, I think particularly on the political right, for a return to meta-narratives that you can trust in and rely on and feel inspired by, and that give you hope when you wake up in the morning. We certainly are in a period where, and I don't want to get too theoretical here, but postmodernism as a cultural paradigm that describes our logic and our structure of feeling. What we say in cultural theory, our system of logic and our structure of feeling has for many, many decades been described with the term postmodernism. We endlessly deconstruct things. We put various sort of arguments that we have on a dialectic where two poles battle it out until one is successful. We ultimately and consistently refer to truth as contingent in some way. Eventually, that becomes enervating. That causes us to lose hope. It causes us to feel that we will be deconstructing eternally and that we will be in crisis eternally. So there is a hunger for a return to meta-narratives. Now, the difference between me, let's say, and someone like Jordan Peterson is that Jordan Peterson is what I would regard as a neo-modernist, which simply means that he wants to return to old and in many cases discarded and what should be inert meta-narratives from 100 years ago or even well before that. What a meta-modernist like me wants to see is a return to meta-narratives with an understanding of everything that we learned during the far too long, far too extended postmodern period of roughly 70 years. We need to have faith in meta-narratives, in other words, even when we know that they're flawed. But we do need to know that they're flawed. We have to have a certain informed naivete about how we wake up in the morning, where we know that deconstruction happened. We know that we were in crisis, but we also know that we need to get up in the morning and soldier on anyway, and that our meta-narratives will be imperfect, but they will inspire us. One of the maxims that is often associated with meta-modernism is that we need a romantic response to crisis. Donald Trump, in the darkest possible sense, is selling a romantic response to crisis. What we need, I would suggest, on the political left in America is a romantic response to crisis that is the light version of what Donald Trump is selling as a very, very dark vision in the view of most of us. I mean, he talked about American carnage during his inaugural speech. We need an alternative to the romantic response to crisis that he's selling.
You're so clever.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yes, we do need that. Now, where's that going to come from, Seth? Because even by your own methods, it sounds like that you have to create this grid of narratives and these reliable nodes and data points. That's sort of almost hyper rational. How do we enter into this new mythos, this new state, this new faith, this new romanticism, jaded, jarred, bruised as we are? How do we revive this kind of a new perspective post Donald Trump's like American carnage? How do we revivify optimism without it tending towards those the dead sort of modernist narratives of sort of fascism, ethno-nationalism, etc.?
Well, I think one of the problems with the way that Donald Trump is approaching it is he wants the same insipid solution for every field, which is make America great again, trust in me, as you said, it's a return to neo-modernist, or a return to modernist narratives like fascism and authoritarianism and so on. With metamodernism, what we're imagining is that this cultural paradigm plays out differently in each field. So there's metamodern architecture, there's metamodern music, there's metamodern stand-up comedy, and it's going to look different in each genre because the conventions that you are trying to both subvert and extend in each of the genres is different. So let's say journalism. In journalism, metamodernism takes the form of metajournalism in the following sense. We say, okay, journalism is at a point of collapse in many respects. People don't trust it anymore. We have a problem with items that are sort of outside journalism, but part of the conversation, ultimately like fake news. How do we respond knowing that we are in a deconstructed journalistic sphere where people have less trust? Well, you make a go of it, and you make a go of it in a romantic and perhaps even quixotic way by saying, I'm going to read 12,000 sources and I'm going to use the internet to help me do this, from around the world, going back decades, and I'm going to show that we actually have so much great investigative journalism that the idea of turning to fake news, the idea of not trusting a single news outlet when someone can now in the digital age create a network of thousands of news outlets, is really just beside the point. So metajournalism is a romantic response to crisis. But, in architecture, people putting gardens atop roofs in major cities, that's a romantic response to crisis. Notice that in that situation, you're not saying, as you might in a postmodern dialectic, well, either we tear down the building or we say, screw it, let's just burn the environment until there's nothing left. You say, well, we're going to keep the building because people live there and we know we can't tear all the buildings down, but we're going to put gardens everywhere that we can, including on the buildings. That's how one example of how metamodernism shows up in architecture. But again, it shows up in every genre. So the answer to your question is depends on the genre, depends on the form of communication being used, depends on the sphere of professional activity we're talking about.
Well, that in itself would be eschewing postmodernism, which would, of course, challenge the taxonomies in themselves, even that these genres exist independently of one another. If you sort of think of it in sort of more simplistic historical forms, like Baroque, the music was Baroque, the architecture was Baroque, like the idea that there would be different streams and different expressions, and we can widely understand Baroque to be sort of, ornamental, florid, like the idea that there would be different approaches in meta-modernism depending on the genre that it was applied to. Now I have a few questions here, mate. One is, where the hell are we getting, because this is what I return to, is if you really want to challenge the some of these, like dear Marianne Williamson said, you're not going to be able to overcome these she said something like dark satanic forces with your technocratic, bureaucratic, claptrap Democrat language. My personal disappointment and condemnation seems like a hard word to use, but falls more on the left than on the right, because in a sense the right is gone all punk and rogue and become mobilized and look like they're having real fun and expressing themselves over there, and whereas the left has become kind of, bereft of any real purpose and meaning, no doubt as a result of this constant deconstructivism that you have described. It seems to me that those ideas are sort of foreclosed, i.e. you almost have to go back to the sort of English origins of socialism as opposed to the sort of European origins, and look at the role of, say, Methodism, that Christian milieu in the establishment of socialism to revivify the left, i.e. does there need to be a spiritual component to any political alternative, even if that spiritualism is not theological but could be sort of personal? And if you're saying that we're going to have to enter into this with the kind of naivety, where do we look? Do we look at in the way that indigenous societies organise and see if we can mobilise those ideas in a urban setting, an example, the architectural example of growing things in cities? Could cities be run in different municipalities? Could power be shared differently? What kind of ideas, and where are we getting the energy? What's the source in this sort of dissipated, grey and insipid time that's so sort of all-consuming that a figure like Trump becomes attractive just almost because of his priapism?
Well, I'd look at it this way. We have nothing left to lose. Many people are awakening this morning on the left and on the right without any hope whatsoever that things will improve. Meta-modernism suggests that it's time for a new sincerity. And let me explain what I mean by that. The sort of rebelliousness that we see on the right now in the United States and perhaps elsewhere is incredibly retrograde. It is that sort of punk rebelliousness that determines that the only way to prove that you are actually rebelling is to do something shocking and to in some way be what some people would consider distasteful. Well, we already did that in the 1970s in the United States with punk rock, literally, right? David Foster Wallace, a novelist who's considered a proto-metamodernist, said that the new rebels, the rebels of the era that we're in now, the meta-modern era, not that he used the term at the time, would be those people who are willing to be snickered at, willing to be laughed at, willing to be considered too naive and too simple and uncool, right? And you're talking to someone right now, Russell, who is incredibly uncool and who gets laughed at all the time. And that's part of the rebellion. I know that. I know that people, look at me and say, this guy's writing 500 tweet threads on Twitter. What does he think he's doing? Where does he think he is that anyone wants to read him write 500 tweets in a row on Twitter? I am deliberately misusing the platform. I know that I'm doing it. I am upsetting people by doing it. I know that I'm doing it. But I'm not trying to be shocking in a punkish way. I'm trying to have a romantic response to crisis, which says, look how naively hopeful this guy is that we can make sense of this world, even though he fully understands, because he lived through postmodernism with everyone else, how ridiculous what he's doing seems to be. I agree with what David Foster Wallace said 25 years ago. The rebels of today are willing to be laughed at, snickered at, considered uncool. The Milo Yiannopoulos of the world who say, I'm going to be punkish and I'm going to shock you, excuse my language, but that's bullshit 40 years ago rebellion. And it's really old hat. It's incredibly postmodern and it's boring. It's boring because, postmodernists have been shocking people with their, crazy statements about Jews, if you want to use Milo Yiannopoulos as an example, for 100 years. That's why postmodernism outstayed its welcome. So the answer is a new sincerity. The answer is hope. And the answer is stop worrying about whether people laugh at you on the internet.